quiet, secluded cave high up on a mountain. You are completely alone.
Right, just total isolation.
Exactly. The surrounding desert is completely silent. The air is still. And then, without any warning at all, the unseen fabric of the universe just violently collapses right on top of you.
Wow.
I mean, it is not a gentle, glowing apparition. It's this terrifying, breath-stealing collision of the spiritual realm crashing directly into our physical reality.
It's just a total shattering of the world,
100%.
Yeah.
And welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a really fascinating stack of classical biographies, historical accounts, and theological analyses to explore the early Meccan period.
Yeah, it's a profound era.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack the foundation of a message that completely reshapes human history. We are looking at the life of Prophet Muhammad, the legacy of the greatest man who ever lived.
And to really do this justice, we are looking at a narrative that demands we move past, just dry dates and timelines.
Right.
To truly understand how this movement survived, we have to examine the emotional, the psychological, and really the legendary mechanisms at play here.
Because the sheer physical gravity of these events fundamentally alters how we view conviction, right?
Absolutely. We're exploring the absolute bedrock of a faith forged under just unimaginable pressure.
And whether you are intimately familiar with these classical sources or, maybe you are hearing this history for the very first time, the sheer weight of how this legacy began commands this incredible sense of awe.
It really does.
So we start at that epicenter, the cave of Hira. Now, the prophet had a practice of retreating there for isolation, for reflection.
Right, just stepping away from society.
Exactly. But on this specific day, the sensory deprivation of that quiet cave is just shattered by the appearance of the angel Gabriel. And the sources are very clear here. The angel does not appear as a man.
No, not at all.
He manifests in his original awe-inspiring angelic form, and he delivers a single forceful command, Ikra, which translates to recite or read.
And the physical toll of that single command was immediate. It wasn't just a conversation.
Wait.
The prophet, who was famously unlettered, responded honestly. He said, "I cannot read." And the angel's response wasn't to just politely repeat the word.
Oh.
Yeah, Jibril grabbed him and squeezed him. The historical texts actually describe this as a literal physical crushing.
Wait, really? Like a physical embrace?
A completely overwhelming one.
Wow.
The angel released him and demanded again, recite. The prophet repeated that he could not read. So a second time, the angel grabbed him, applying that immense, crushing pressure, then let go and repeated the command.
Oh, my goodness.
This sequence happened 3 times. 3 times he was physically overwhelmed and squeezed to the absolute limits of his endurance before the very first verses of the revelation were spoken.
Well, let's unpack this because it forces us to completely rethink what a divine encounter actually is.
Right.
We usually think of it as this serene, peaceful whisper. But here, the spiritual world is so vastly dense, so unimaginably heavy, that a human body can barely withstand direct contact with it.
It's almost too much reality to process at once.
Exactly. And he survives this encounter and just runs down the mountain, returning home, shivering uncontrollably.
Just in a state of absolute shock.
Yes, he's begging his wife, Khadijah, wrap me in a garment, wrap me in a garment. He's experiencing this profound physiological shock, freezing from the terror of it all.
He was terrified.
He even expresses fear for his own sanity, worrying he might have, fallen victim to sorcery or evil spirits, which was something he inherently despised.
And that moment really highlights the vital psychological grounding provided by Khadijah.
Oh, her reaction is incredible.
It is. She becomes the absolute anchor he needs to process this trauma. She doesn't just offer him a blanket and emotional comfort. She uses this profound deductive logic to stabilize him.
Right. She goes straight to his character.
Exactly. She points to his historical character. She tells him that God would never forsake him or allow evil to harm him because of how he lives his life. She reminds him, you support the needy, you help the poor.
You bear the burdens of the weak.
Yes. And you are generous to guests. Her premise is that a man whose baseline nature is so fiercely dedicated to righteous, selfless action, he possesses a structural integrity that divine forces simply do not abandon.
It's just an incredible display of intellectual and emotional partnership. I mean, in the aftermath of a cosmic, reality-breaking event, the immediate survival of the message essentially comes down to a husband and a wife.
It's beautiful.
And her ability to anchor him to his own goodness. She then seeks counsel from her cousin, Waraka, who was a lettered Christian who understood ancient scriptures, to further contextualize what just happened.
Right, getting that historical verification.
But, surviving that initial shock is just step one. You cannot just go back to a normal daily routine after an archangel literally crushes you in a cave.
Definitely not.
This requires an entirely new level of internal endurance, which naturally leads to asking how they built that, the intense spiritual training program the early followers had to undergo.
Right. The difficulties ahead of this small, nascent community were going to be completely unprecedented. To survive the social and physical persecution that was coming, they needed an unshakable internal architecture.
Needed to be tough.
Unbreakable, really. So the sources detail this mandatory spiritual regimen centered around two practices. First is Qiyam al-Layl, which involves standing in prayer deep in the night.
The middle of the night.
Yes. And the second is Dik, the continuous, repetitive remembrance of God.
Okay, but from a purely physiological standpoint, that sounds like a recipe for severe burnout.
Oh, it sounds exhausting, right?
Yeah. I mean, you are dealing with the immense stress of a massive paradigm shift, huge societal pushback, and on top of that, you are actively depriving yourself of sleep to stand in the dark and pray.
It seems totally counterintuitive until you look at the mechanism of spiritual fueling.
Okay.
There is this deeply instructive anecdote from a much later historical scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, that really illustrates how this actually worked.
Oh, I read about this. This is fascinating.
Yeah. He had a practice of going out to the fields of Damascus after the dawn prayer and just sitting in isolation, engaging in dhikr until the sun rose.
Every morning.
Every morning. And when questioned about this really demanding daily routine, he referred to it as his breakfast.
Breakfast for the soul.
Exactly. He stated that this remembrance was actual nourishment for his soul, and without it, his physical body would fail him throughout the day. The spiritual connection wasn't an expenditure of energy, it was the mechanism of generation.
Wow. So they were essentially severing ties with the sleeping physical world to tap into an eternal energy source.
That's a great way to put it.
When I was going through the sources, there's a specific metaphor used to describe this early group of companions, the Sahaba. It says that if Islam is a tent, this core group of early believers is the central pillar holding it up.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the physics of a desert tent.
Oh, the wind and the sand.
Exactly. The outer canvas takes the relentless beating from the wind, the sand, the heat. But that canvas is completely useless without the rigid central pole bearing the tension.
Without the pole, the whole thing just collapses in the sand.
And that structural tension is exactly why the internal training was so rigorous. This early group numbered perhaps fewer than 100 people initially.
Very small group.
Very small. If their internal tensile strength gave way under the pressure of the Meccan persecution, the entire structure of the faith would have collapsed right there. They had to be rigid enough to hold up a whole society.
And they also engineered a really brilliant social stabilizing mechanism to help bear that weight.
Right, the brotherhood.
Yes. When the early Muslims who fled Mecca the Muhashirun arrived in Medina, they were completely stripped of their wealth and status. The Prophet instituted a literal binding brotherhood between them and the believers in Medina, the Ansar.
And it wasn't just a symbolic title.
Not at all. They were paired up one-to-one. The Ansar physically shared their property, their homes, and their financial resources.
50-50. It's unheard of.
It really is. They distributed the psychological and economic weight of the new religion so that no single pillar had to bear the load alone.
That distribution of weight was absolutely crucial for their survival. It created this unified, reinforced social fabric. But at the very center of this massive social and spiritual movement is a fascinating historical reality regarding how the knowledge itself was transmitted and preserved.
And this is where the sources present a deeply thought-provoking paradox. Wait, the very first word of this revelation, the foundation of this entire legacy, is essentially a command to read or recite, right?
Yes, Iqra.
Yet the prophet himself was famously unlettered. Isn't it a paradox that the greatest push for global literacy began with a man who couldn't read a single word?
It sounds like a paradox, but the texts frame this illiteracy not as a deficiency, but as a highly calibrated divine protective mechanism.
Protected how?
It was a specific decree designed to preserve the absolute purity of the message. Think about it. If the prophet had been a scholar of previous scriptures, or a man known for reading and writing ancient texts, critics would have had a very easy, logical argument against the revelation.
Oh, I see. They would say he just copied it.
Exactly. They could simply claim he synthesized old philosophies, copied past scriptures, and presented it as a new revelation.
Wow, so the illiteracy served as an impenetrable shield against accusations of plagiarism.
Absolutely. For him, Ikra meant to vocalize the fresh, unseen knowledge being placed directly into his heart. But for his followers and the entire civilization that followed, the command literally meant to pick up the pen.
To actually read and write.
Yes. And when reading about the Battle of Badr, there is a detail regarding the prisoners of war that completely recontextualizes the societal values of that time.
Oh, the ransom.
Yes. The ransom mechanism at Badr is a perfect example of this. In ancient warfare, prisoners were typically ransomed for gold, livestock, or weapons.
Right, physical wealth.
But in this instance, a literate prisoner of war could earn their total freedom through a different currency, teaching 10 Muslims how to read and write.
That is just wild. Teach 10 people to read and you are a free man.
The acquisition of literacy was valued on par with human freedom and financial wealth.
It is a stunning elevation of the intellect. But the sources also emphasize that it wasn't just a free-for-all consumption of any information you could get your hands on.
No, definitely not.
There was a strict pedagogy regarding what was consumed and in what order. There's a story about Umar, one of the most prominent companions, which really illustrates how fiercely the foundation of knowledge was guarded.
Right. Umar was seen reading from scrolls belonging to the children of Israel previous scriptures. And when the prophet saw this, he became visibly angry, his face actually turning red, and he strictly prohibited Umar from reading them at that time.
Which, honestly, banning an eager student from reading historical texts seems incredibly restrictive for a society that just traded prisoners of war for literacy.
It does seem that way, but the restriction was based on a profound understanding of cognitive scaffolding.
Okay, explain that.
Well, in those early days, the foundational theology of the community was still being built. When a student's core foundation is still setting, exposing them to complex, unverified, or competing texts can cause structural failure in their belief system.
Oh, so it introduces doubt before they have the framework to process it.
Exactly. Once the Islamic foundation was fully solidified and unshakable years later, the Prophet permitted the reading of those older stories. He provided the analytical tool to navigate them, which was basically neither completely believe nor completely disbelieve anything that the Quran itself does not verify.
You don't teach advanced theoretical physics to a student who is still learning basic algebra. The foundation must be protected.
Spot on.
And observing how fiercely the intellectual purity of the message was guarded naturally draws our attention to the actual physical mechanics of how this knowledge was delivered. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It gets incredibly visceral.
The scholar Ibn al-Qayyim actually categorized the escalation of the revelation into 7 distinct stages.
Which is an incredible piece of scholarship on its own, especially considering Ibn al-Qayyim wrote his exhaustive volume on the Prophet's life entirely from memory while traveling.
Wait, from memory? While traveling? That is insane.
Yeah, it's brilliant. He meticulously outlines how the divine communication escalated. The first stage began subtly with true dreams. For 6 months, the Prophet would experience vivid dreams that would manifest in waking reality the very next day with absolute precision.
So it was like a gentle introduction to the unseen world before the intensity ramps up.
Precisely. You ease into it. The second stage involved unseen inspiration being cast directly into his heart and mind without him physically seeing the angel.
Okay.
Then the third stage was the angel appearing in the physical form of a human being, making the interaction comprehensible and conversational. But the fourth stage is where the physical reality of revelation becomes overwhelmingly visceral. The sources describe it as the ringing of the bell.
Yes. And when the sources detail the mechanics of this ringing bell, it paints a picture of agonizing physical pressure.
Absolute agony.
The prophet would hear a violent, continuous sound, which the texts compare to the sheer vibration of angelic wings or the heavy grating noise of a steel chain being dragged across solid rock.
It was not a passive listening experience at all.
No. The divine words carried a literal crushing weight as they entered the physical plane.
And the physiological evidence of this weight is heavily documented. Even on the most freezing, bitter, cold days, sweat would stream profusely down the prophet's forehead from the sheer internal exertion of receiving the words.
That is just mind-blowing, and it affected the physical environment around him, too. There are accounts where the prophet was mounted on his camel when the revelation suddenly descended.
Oh, the camel story.
Yes. The invisible gravity of the words was so immensely heavy that the massive animal would buckle, Its back would bend, forced entirely to its knees against its will.
A literal beast of burden brought down by words.
And in another instance, the prophet was sitting with his knee resting on the thigh of a companion when the revelation hit. The companion later recounted the sheer terror of feeling like his thigh bone was going to shatter under the sudden, immense pressure.
The transition from the spiritual to the physical realm is clearly not without extreme friction.
No kidding.
And following that, the fifth stage was the rare occurrence of seeing Jibril in his true, original angelic form. This happened only twice, and the visual magnitude is staggering.
Tell me about the wings.
Jibril possessed wings so impossibly massive that they blotted out the entire horizon. Every direction the prophet looked, the sky was completely consumed by the wings of the angel.
That is terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Stage 6 involved revelation given above the heavens during the miraculous night journey, the Mirage. And finally, Stage 7 was direct, unmediated speech from God, a privilege historically shared only with Moses. When you process the sheer scale of these mechanics, I mean, a human being whose body radiates intense heat in the freezing cold under the crush of divine words, who has watched an archangel dwarf the Earth's horizon, you realize how violently this calibrates a person's perception of reality.
It changes everything.
The material world, money, status, physical comfort must instantly render into dust.
What you are describing is the exact definition of yakin.
Yakin.
Yes. Yakin is the ultimate state of conviction. It is the psychological and spiritual threshold where the heart absorbs faith so completely that the unseen world becomes more real, more tangible, and more reliable than the physical objects you can touch with your own hands.
The ultimate unmasking of the worldly illusion.
Exactly.
And to understand what yakin looks like in practice, the sources point to Ajia, the wife of the pharaoh. She is the historical archetype of this conviction.
She truly is.
She inhabited the absolute pinnacle of worldly existence. Limitless wealth, palaces, ultimate political power, an army of servants. She had access to the maximum luxury the physical world could offer.
The absolute peak.
Right. Yet she gladly discarded every single piece of it, rejecting the profound corruption of her environment, and prayed instead for a house in paradise. She possessed the yakin to choose the eternal unseen over the ultimate physical reality.
And we see that same powerful prioritization in the household of the prophet himself, particularly in the story of his only surviving daughter, Fatima.
Oh, this story is so deeply emotional.
It really is. Her situation provides a stark contrast to what we might expect. I mean, as the beloved daughter of the leader of a growing, powerful community, you would naturally assume she lived a life insulated from hardship.
Of course you would.
Yet the historical accounts detail her grueling physical reality.
The physical toll on her body is jarring to read. She operated a heavy stone mill by hand to grind grain until the skin on her hands became thick and heavily calloused.
Just raw from the stone.
Yeah. She drew water from the local wells, hauling it until the heavy, coarse ropes left permanent, deep scars across her neck. She managed the fire and the cooking until her clothes were blackened and her face was affected by the constant smoke and heat.
The physical suffering reached a point where she finally approached her father to request a servant to assist her with the labor. The prophet had the means and the authority to grant her this relief, yet he chose not to provide her with a servant.
Which, on a purely human level, feels deeply counterintuitive. If you possess the power to alleviate your child's physical suffering, why would you withhold it?
And this raises an important question about priorities. The mechanism behind his decision is a masterclass in yakin and eternal prioritization.
Okay, how so?
Instead of a servant to ease her temporary physical burden, he gave her a spiritual tool. He instructed her that every night before she went to sleep, she should recite specific words of dhikr, glorifying and praising God 33 times each.
The words of remembrance.
Yes. He assured her that this internal spiritual practice was objectively better for her than the physical relief of a servant. Look, he understood her physical agony intimately, and he loved her profoundly. But true yakin dictates that you direct the ones you love most toward everlasting, eternal reward, even if it means enduring the fleeting hardships of the temporary world.
Wow. It fundamentally redefines the concept of parental provision. He provided for her eternal soul rather than her temporary physical comfort.
Beautifully said.
So you have this core inner circle, Khadija, who anchored him immediately. Abu Bakr, who accepted the terrifying reality without a fraction of a second's hesitation. Ali, Zayd, Fatima, they all possess this intense, uncompromising yakin.
Right, they were the foundation.
But a critical tension arises when this completely unsugar-coated, demanding reality is finally broadcast to a general public who are entirely addicted to the material world.
Oh, absolutely. And that tension snaps publicly at Mount Safa. After 3 years of building this rigid internal foundation in secret, the prophet receives the command to warn the broader society. He ascends Mount Safa and utilizes a very specific mechanism to gather the city. He cries out, "Wasabaha!"
And that specific phrase is not just a casual invitation to a public forum. It operates exactly like an emergency air raid siren.
Exactly.
It was a distress signal reserved exclusively for imminent, catastrophic threats, like an invading army at the city gates. When that siren sounds, the physiological response is immediate. The people of the Quraysh dropped their commerce and rushed to the mountain. If a man physically could not go, he dispatched a messenger to identify the existential threat.
Right. So he has their absolute undivided attention, their adrenaline is spiking, and he starts by confirming his own baseline reliability. He asks them, "If I informed you that an army was cavalry riding out from behind this mountain to attack you, would you believe me?"
Set in the baseline.
Exactly. And they immediately affirm his lifelong, flawless character, stating they have never experienced a single lie from him.
He establishes the empirical truth of his character, and then he drops the revelation. He doesn't ease them into the theology. He plainly states, "I am a warner to you before a severe punishment."
Just straight to the point.
No padding. He presents the terrifying reality of the unseen world with zero padding. Because when you are sounding an alarm for eternal destruction, you do not obscure the message with pleasantries.
But the immediate reaction from the crowd is not submission. It is hostile rejection, spearheaded by a man named Abu Lahab. And the psychological mechanism behind Abu Lahab's fury is fascinating here.
How so?
Well, his immediate reaction isn't an extended debate about the existence of the unseen. He doesn't argue the theology. He is primarily enraged by the interruption.
Wow.
Yeah, he curses the prophet, shouting, "May you perish! Is this what you gathered us for?"
It is a textbook case of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Abu Lahab's entire psychological framework is rooted in his ledger, his status, and his wealth. Confronting the crushing reality of an eternal consequence is terrifying.
Yeah.
So instead of grappling with the profound theological warning, his mind protects itself by focusing on the inconvenience. He is furious that his valuable business hours were disrupted for something he cannot physically weigh or sell.
The material world acts as an anesthetic against the demands of the spiritual world. Abu Lahab was anesthetized by his wealth. To him, anything that didn't yield an immediate, tangible profit was a worthless distraction.
And before we judge Abu Lahab too harshly, the sources force us to look in the mirror with a highly relevant analogy. How often do our own psychological mechanisms mirror his exactly? Consider the sheer volume of time and energy we dedicate to temporary material gains. If you are purchasing a used vehicle or a new appliance, you will happily sacrifice weeks of your life.
Oh, for sure.
You will scour classified ads, cross-reference the Kelly Blue Book, endure hours of negotiation, and drive to multiple dealerships, completely obsessing over retaining a few $100s. Yet, if someone requests 30 minutes of your time to critically discuss the eternal trajectory of your soul, the immediate instinctual response is, "I am too busy. I have work to do."
We meticulously optimize our temporary business hours while entirely bankrupting our eternal reality. And the divine response to Abu Lahab addresses this exact psychological trap. The subsequent verses revealed regarding him state unequivocally that his wealth and his worldly gains, the very shields he used to block out the warning, will ultimately perish and provide him absolutely zero defense against the severe reality he ignored.
The ultimate realization that the ledger cannot save you.
Exactly.
Well, we have traveled a massive historical and psychological arc in this deep dive. We started in the terrifying sensory isolation of a cave, witnessing the crushing physical weight of the divine world collapsing into our own.
A literal crush.
We examined the rigorous internal engineering required to bear that weight, turning night prayers into the tensile strength of a new society. We saw how the absolute purity of the intellect was guarded, and how the conviction of Yaqeen redefines human suffering and priorities.
And finally, we watched that profound reality clash against the blinding illusion of material wealth on Mount Safa.
And as we close, consider the contrasting weights we've discussed today. We saw the physical weight of divine truth, a force so dense it could drive a massive camel to its knees and cause a man to pour sweat in the freezing cold.
Contrast that with the invisible, insidious weight of the daily choices we make. Every single time we prioritize our temporary routines, our financial ledgers, and our physical comfort over our eternal legacy, we are accumulating a different kind of burden.
So what are the business hours in your own life? What are the meticulously managed modern distractions that are anesthetizing you, blinding you to the mountaintop warnings sounding right in front of you? Thank you for taking this profound, emotional deep dive into the legacy of the greatest man who ever lived. Keep questioning those daily choices, and remember that the unseen reality is often infinitely heavier than the illusions we can touch.